What's up, guys? I can't do it. I just can't. But I am, in this bonus lesson, going to attempt to channel Andrew Kramer. So Andrew Kramer, probably heard of him. He's sort of the king of using After Effects in super clever ways to create effects that, on first glance, you might think need a plugin or even real footage. And so in this bonus lesson, what I'm going to try to instill in you is sort of this adventurous spirit, a willingness to take the Swiss Army knife that is After Effects and to try different combinations of things like a mad scientist or a chef until you can start to arrive at your own recipes for effects. I want you to learn how to take an image that you like or a reference image your client gives you, look at it, break apart the little visual details that make it feel the way it does, and then think about how you can use built-in effects in After Effects to recreate the same thing. You don't always need a plugin. In fact, in most cases, you don't need it. It may save you time, but I think it's really handy to get the hang of Kramering. Can we call it that? Do we have to pay somebody? Will we get sued? All right, so for this bonus lesson, Dr. Premult is going to help us out. And what I'd like to do is show you a few reference images and talk about some of the visual signifiers that I see in them and how I might approach mimicking them inside of After Effects. So this is kind of a neat reference image because it's kind of creepy. It's got this silhouette look, and there's this interesting kind of smoky, hazy, foggy thing going on. Now, if a client gave you this as reference and then this is your talent and said, make this look like this, that is a actually frighteningly common thing to happen. And so it's really helpful if you can learn to start to see like a compositor. So let's start with the obvious, okay, the color. Now you can see that I have put a deep blue solid here, which would be a great band name, by the way, as the background, okay? I've sort of already pick-whipped this to kind of mimic the look of it, okay? So we've also got all of this light happening back here, right? It looks like there's some sort of light back there, and there's all this mist and smoke, and so we need to start to build up this image to mimic that. So what I'm going to do is start really simple, okay? And this is typically what I do. I'll just grab like a shape layer, and I'm just going to, I don't know, draw basically an ellipse right behind Dr. Premult, like so. And I'm going to position it right above the background. And then as far as the color goes, I'm going to grab kind of, I don't know, maybe like this bluish white color kind of right in the middle. You know, you can see there's a lot going on here with the color. It's really saturated on the edges as it gets darker, and then in the middle it's less saturated. And that's actually kind of tricky to pull off using the built-in kind of glow tools in After Effects. So I'm going to show you how I approach stuff like this. All right, so we've got this big shape. Now I'm already starting to notice little visual cues here, okay? There's obviously not a big hard-edged ellipse back here. This looks to me like it's been blurred or feathered or something like that, okay? And I want you to notice how I'm gonna stop calling things what they are, for example, smoke or mist, and I'm gonna start talking about them in terms of what they look like. And that's how you're gonna start retraining your brain. So this looks not like a hard-edged ellipse. This looks like a soft edge sort of shape back there. So how could I make the edges soft? I could blur it, okay? By the way, you're going to see me use this tool a lot just to speed up this lesson. This is Video Copilot's console plugin, and it's basically a quick menu for After Effects, and it's free. We will link to it in the notes for this lesson. But I'm just going to put a fast blur on here. Let me do the fast box blur, and I'm just going to blur this, okay? So now we're getting somewhere. Now, if I zoom out to look at all of this reference here, obviously there's something wrong. It's not working yet. So part of it is this character's legs kind of disappear into the dark area down here. So I'm going to reshape this a little bit, move this up a tiny bit. One thing I'm really noticing though is that, you know, I thought this was a pretty bright shape, but as soon as I blurred it, it got all muddy and washed out. See how nice and bright it is in the middle in these pixels here? So how could I do that? I could try, I don't know, I could try color correcting this or something. Sometimes trying to get too clever is your enemy. All I'm going to do is duplicate that shape layer, and I'm going to scale it down a little bit, and then I'm going to change the color to white. That's it, right? And now I'm going to kind of play with this, scale this up and down, and maybe I could even change the transfer mode to add, right? So it kind of starts to blow things out a little bit. okay? And that's getting a little heavy, so maybe I'll try screen, make sure that the opacity is 100%. And it's still not as bright as I'd like, and so I think what's going on is I need more contrast with this shape underneath it. So I'm just gonna come in, kind of do something like that. There we go. And now I'm starting to get something kind of resembling that contrast. I think there's also too much blur on this inner layer. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, check that out. So two shapes blurred, and we're starting to approximate the look of this, okay? Obviously, that's not the hard part. All right, so what's next? This silhouette look, all right? So if a client said, I want this to look like a silhouette, well, what constitutes a silhouette, right? That's one of those words, you know what it means when someone says it, but have you ever really looked at a silhouette and figured out why it looks the way it does? So looking at this, what I'm noticing is basically all of the details gone. And it is whatever color the shadows in this image are, which in this case is this dark blue. But it's not completely flat. Like along the edges, there's a little bit of glow, right? There's a little bit of light coming back. And there's a teeny bit of detail showing through, right? And obviously there's like some sort of wispy shapes passing in front. But, you know, the start to a silhouette is obviously remove all the detail and make this the same color as the shadows. So that's pretty easy. I'm going to use the fill effect for that. All right, so fill. And I'm just going to color pick this. All right, and now, all right, we're getting somewhere. You know, this kind of light wrap thing, I'm not going to worry about that yet. We'll do that in a little bit. I want to get into the fun stuff. I want to get into all of this wispiness, these interesting wispy shapes. Now notice I'm trying not to use the actual English word for what they are. You might think it's strange that I'm trying not to say the word smoke. There's a good reason. When I say smoke to someone that's kind of new to visual effects, I find that typically they think too literally about it. They think, oh, I need a smoke element or I need a smoke plugin. When in fact, all you need to do is look at some smoke and be able to break apart the visual characteristics of it, which you can then recreate using tools like fractal noise and blurs and things like that. That's what I want you to start doing. So I'm going to try to not say smoke. I'm going to fail. I'm going to say smoke a lot in this bonus lesson, but I want you to just start noticing the details and how to recreate those. Here we go. It's kind of a philosophical question. What makes smoke look like smoke? Well, there's sort of a wispiness to it. It's kind of wavy, and there's really, just describe it in terms of design language. It's sort of overlapping shapes. And obviously there's a way that smoke sort of moves that will tell you that it's smoke. But even just without this thing moving at all, you can tell what this is, right? It's wispy and there's little curls to it and it kind of obscures things, right, that are behind it. Pretend that you didn't know what smoke was and someone said, I want you to make kind of this wispy, wavy pattern that kind of desaturates things that are behind it. What could you use in After Effects? And I want you to think about that for a second before I actually tell you the answer. Okay, because this is how you become a really good compositor. You start thinking like a chef. I have some scallops and I have some butter and I have some salt. What can I do with that? That's how you should be thinking. I don't know why I picked scallops. I could have picked any food. All right, we're going to use fractal noise. And it's probably not going to be a surprise because fractal noise is the Swiss Army knife inside the Swiss Army knife. It can do a million things. So what we're going to do is make a new layer. I'm going to name it Smoke, against my better judgment, and I'm going to add the fractal noise effect to it, okay? Fractal noise, like most effects in After Effects, come with defaults that are kind of useless, okay? So you've probably turned this on at one point and said, what the hell do I do with this? Well, it has a lot of different kinds of noises, and you should, at some point in your career, kind of look through them all and mess around with the evolution of them all because, you know, you can see dynamic noise looks different, right? It's kind of bubbly and lumpy. And if I go down to, say, smeary noise, right, it's kind of liquidy and interesting and gooey, right? So looking at this image here, which of these noise types is the closest to this? And it may not be obvious. I mean, this is something that you'll have to kind of play around with. Cloudy certainly doesn't actually look that cloudy to me, but maybe it's a good place to start. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, all right, this is kind of smoky looking, but it's also very blobby and blocky. So I kind of want to play around with the settings to see if I can make this more, more smoky. Using fractal noise just takes practice. And so you're going to have to kind of experiment until you get a sixth sense for this. But I can tell you that complexity does exactly what you think it does. It adds kind of detail to the noise, right? Which you can tell even with this kind of low res image I picked, there's a ton of detail to it. But then there's also these larger details here, right? These kind of big areas of white and then these tiny little details. And these big areas of white are controlled by this transform. So I can scale this whole thing up like this, right? And what I probably want in the end is a mixture of some big pieces and some little pieces, right? So that it feels kind of natural and broken up. So I'm going to scale this up. And one thing that's also good to play around with is to turn off uniform scaling, because sometimes, and actually a lot of the times, you don't want uniform scaling. Just kind of stretching this noise out makes it feel a little smokier to me, right? Now, some of the things I'm going to do, I'm going to offset this turbulence kind of left to right so it feels like it's moving, all right? I'm also going to animate the evolution of this so that there's kind of some movement within that happening. Another really important thing in fractal noise is the sub settings. And if I zoom way in, sub settings are sort of the fine details behind the main noise. So if I turn the sub influence to 0, you can see this entire thing gets really flattened out. Now, this is actually useful because this is also giving me a good idea of what the noise is going to feel like overall, just by sort of playing with, you know, the offset and the evolution. And I feel like right now it's nice, except there's a little too much contrast there. So maybe I'll bring that contrast down. I can bring the brightness up, but bring that contrast down, because I don't want so many of these hard edges, right? And this also, you know, the word I just said, hard edge, that should give you another hint as to another way that you could sort of affect this and make this work a little bit better for you. These edges are too hard. Well, what is something that softens edges? A blur. So let's do another fast blur on this, right? And by the way, you know, I've done this before, of course, right? But the recipe you're watching me put together is different than I've ever done, because the whole point, what I'm trying to show you, is not how to make smoke in After Effects. It's how to attempt and look at and approach making smoke in After Effects. It's kind of a tricky thing to teach, so hopefully I'll be kind of successful. All right, so I blurred it a little bit. And so now, you know, you can kind of imagine this thing like evolving and moving, and it feels like a little smoky. Now, if I turn that sub influence back up, I'm bringing back some of that detail, okay? And that detail has its own set of controls. I can scale that up or down too, but this is starting to feel kind of, sort of smoky. Now, I've blurred this. Looking at this, I'm seeing there's also hard edges to it, right? It's like it's blurry and fuzzy, but it's also not. So I could try to get that effect all in this one layer somehow, but that's silly, okay? It's a compositing tool. You can use more than one layer. So this is going to be the soft and fuzzy layer. So let's go ahead and animate this really quickly. So what I want to do is animate the offset turbulence. So I'm going to option click here, and the expression for this, and you can just copy this one if you ever need this. It's x equals time times, and then I need to figure out how fast I want it to move. And honestly, I don't know. I'm going to guess. I'm going to say 500 pixels per second. And then y, doesn't really matter. Y could equal 0. And then you have to return an array because this is a two-dimensional property. And there we go. And so now this thing is moving about like that. And if I do a quick RAM preview, it's a little bit slow. Why don't we boost that up to 700 and call that good enough for government? For the evolution, it's an even simpler expression. It's just time times a number. And let's try 100. And so now it's moving, but it's also kind of changing over time, right? Let me RAM preview out 3 seconds so that we can really kind of get a sense of what we're getting. All right, it's not bad. So what do we do with this? You know, I could just screen this over, right? And it actually already kind of looks smoky. Pretty interesting, right? But I feel like the evolution isn't happening fast enough, so I'm going to change that to time times, I don't know, maybe 300 and see what that does. Yeah, and that's probably going to be too fast, but now, you know, you can sort of see how there's really just a ton of trial and error to this. So I'm going to go to 150. And then the other problem is it doesn't look like this, right? It's not how it's supposed to look. And so what I want to do is zoom in on this image and really look closely at the character of this smoky stuff. Right? First of all, it's not white. It's kind of blue, right? So that's my first hint. I'm going to need to tint this. So I'm going to add, strangely enough, the tint effect. And I'm going to just kind of pick one of these colors, and yeah, it kind of works. I might brighten it up a little bit. And actually, what would be even better than tint is sort of tint on steroids, which is called the tritone effect. Now, how do I know all these effects off the top of my head? Well, I've been using After Effects for many years, and I have done my homework and experimented quite a bit. And so you should too, and this will take time. You will not be as fast at this, obviously, right at the beginning. However, over time, you are going to get really good at kind of guessing recipes and getting pretty close, okay? Cool. So here's smoke off and on, and I can now dial it in with kind of like some opacity here. And I feel like I'm not getting enough contrast in there, so I might go back into fractal noise and boost that contrast up a little bit, maybe boost the brightness a little bit, and kind of play around with like the amount of smoke that I'm seeing through here, right? So I can like lower, there we go. Now we're starting to break it up a little bit. So I'm playing with the brightness, I'm playing with the contrast, and I'm trying to find that right balance. Cool. So now we've got kind of something interesting going on here. Does it look like smoke? Well, not really, not so much, not yet, but we're gonna get there. So what else is it missing? Well, first of all, it's this completely flat texture, right? It's just these flat, areas kind of moving and evolving. And smoke doesn't look like that. Smoke has all this kind of grit and texture to it, Like, look at this stuff, right? All of these shapes have noise and kind of a pattern to them. So how might I add that to this? Well, a theme that you're gonna see in this lesson is that you duplicate stuff. So let me duplicate this fractal noise. And I'm going to move it to the bottom here. I'm going to solo this for a minute so you can really see what's going on. If I duplicate this fractal noise and I set this to a different kind of fractal noise, and I set the blending mode to something like multiply, it will use the fractal noise that is already there, and it will simply put more noise on top of it. And so what I could do is kind of mess around with the contrast and the brightness settings here, and the scale, most importantly. Right, so let me go into the transform and scale this down a little bit. And now you can see that that basic sort of setup of the initial base layer of fractal noise, it's still there. I'm just sort of layering this extra detail on top of it. And I can actually adjust the opacity and all that stuff. So now I get something that's a little bit more smoke-like. I'm going to show you another setting that I forgot to turn on. When you animate the turbulence like this, and let me turn off the second copy. If you turn on this perspective offset, something amazing happens. The overall noise moves at one speed and then the sub noise moves at a different speed. It gives it a little bit more of a 3D effect. So obviously, if you're going for something like this, you want that on, and I'm going to turn it on this layer too. And so by adding this extra layer of noise on top of the noise we already have, we're getting something a little more, I don't want to say smoky, but it's a little more smoky, okay? What else could we do? Because, also, looking at this image, there's these nice little sort of swirls and eddies and things like that I really like. And there's also this sharpness to it that I feel like we're losing here because I blurred it, but blurring it actually kind of made it look more like the S word. So this is going to seem weird to you, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to blur this even a little bit more. And then I'm going to do something very unorthodox here. I'm going to sharpen this. And you'd be amazed at the interesting results you get when you sharpen things in After Effects. Look at all that noise that sort of showed up now for free. And now we've got a much more kind of interesting texture here to all of this. All right, so let me unsolo this. And you can see even just as a still, it's starting to work a lot better. The last thing I want to do to add some of those like swirls and eddies is add one of my all-time favorite effects. So we'll go to Distort, Turbulent Displace. Okay. And what's interesting is all of these effects are based on fractal noise. Turbulent displace is fractal noise plus a displacement map. That's essentially what it is. And there's a bunch of different modes to it. And there's one called twist, and there's a smoother twist, which might give us a little bit better quality. But let's try this one. And you can see if I crank up the amount, it's basically like, swirling all of this stuff around, right? And if I turn the size down, I can actually get quite a bit of little details and stuff in this. And if I turn the complexity up, right, it gets even more interesting. And the evolution doesn't really need to change or anything like that because the layer underneath is already moving. It's moving through this displacement. You can see it's creating this very interesting effect. And if I sort of scrub through, you can see now this is way too heavy, right? And the size is probably like, too small. So I just want like a little bit of this, right? So the size might need to actually be bigger, so that's not so noticeable, but the amount can be really, really pretty small, right? And there we go. And then the quality is probably going to be just fine on low, so I'm going to leave that. And now we'll do a little preview, right? And now we're starting to get something that feels, it's moving a little bit too fast, but it does feel kind of smoky. So let me just go ahead and slow these down a little bit so that it feels a little more natural. And then we're going to move on and start layering some other things. So I want to point out, you just watched me put 6 effects on one layer to get one piece of a little bit of a smoke. I'll say it, smoke effect. And that's pretty typical. And you might be thinking, well, Joey, I don't have this, knowledge in my head yet of what every effect is and what they do and how they work when combined. And I didn't either. The way I got this knowledge was by experimenting. And what you're seeing in this bonus lesson is not just me knowing exactly what effect to pull. I'm also trying things. You're going to see things work. You're going to see things fail. I'm going to have to try new things. And I want you to kind of see the process. Now, of course, you're seeing it from someone who's been doing this a long time, but you will be doing this a long time too. And I just want you to see that this is what it looks like. You're literally opening up your spice rack and trying things, and it tastes terrible. But that combination was just right. Okay, so let's hop back in. So the smoke layer needs to be broken up a little bit, right? Right now it's just like this uniform thing. And so this is actually a really fun part. So what I'm gonna do is just kind of mask out like some different pieces of it, like this, right? And I kind of don't want it too much towards the bottom. And then what I'm gonna do is just feather all of these. So I can just sort of like feather this main one, feather this one, feather this one, and then this green one at the bottom here, I'm gonna feather it, but I'm also going to turn down the mask opacity of it, right? Because I kind of don't want, I kind of want some different stuff down here, okay? And so just doing that, just kind of breaking it up, we're already kind of getting something, aren't we? Let's duplicate this and make another layer. Let me show you something. Once you've got something working that you like, you can then iterate on it. So this smoke here, and I know that I just said the S word, but hopefully you'll forgive me. So this smoke layer here, this is going to work really well, you know, for sort of being like in front of the main subject. And I actually am going to dial it back quite a bit because I don't want that much of it. Let me turn this layer off. I don't want too much of it to show up in front like that. I want mostly in the back. So then I'm going to duplicate this, put it behind. Then I'm going to crank that opacity up. And maybe on this front version here, I can delete these masks. Right, so it's kind of just showing up in front of the person, but everything else is kind of happening behind, right? So I've got sort of like some foreground and some background versions of this to kind of break everything up, right? And they're all a little bit different too. But the noise that's being generated by them is actually identical. But that's very easy to fix. All I need to do is come in here, go to evolution options, and change the random seed. And by changing the random seed, I get totally different noise. So it's really, really easy. And I should, if I'm being thorough, I should do that on both sets. And so now, if we preview this, you can see that you've got some in the foreground and then some in the background. And in the background, I could even play with a different transfer mode here to see what I get if I throw that in overlay mode or something like that, right? Now, you're getting a much different effect, and it's pretty harsh, so I'm going to kind of tone that back. And I don't like what's happening with those blacks, so I'm going to tell the tritone effect to be blue. And just to show you what that did, if I zoom in right here, and I undo what I just did, you'll see that when it was black, it was making a black spot there. But I color corrected it, so it's blue. So I'm kind of diagnosing little things here, okay? Excellent. All right, we're getting somewhere, I think I also would like to take my Dr. Premalt, scale him back, put him like a little bit further back in the scene. And now this is creating a problem because I can see his feet. And I want it to feel like he's disappearing into the mist or something like that. So what I probably need to do is turn up the opacity on this a little bit. And just to see what it looks like, let me turn this on overlay mode. Yeah, I don't like that. But what I do want to do is mask out his legs. So let me just go like this, invert that, feather that, boom, done, right? Next, I am going to take this top layer of the S word, and I'm going to scale it up like this, and then I'm going to move it down like so. Now, why did I scale it up? Well, because I kind of want to mimic the effect of it being closer to camera, right? And so rather than have to actually go into all these effects and everything, I just scaled the thing up, right? And you'll see that that's going to work. But obviously, down here in this image, you don't have this crazy sort of layer of fog or smoke or whatever. So this is going to be super toned down, like just a teeny bit, just some poking through. And frankly, I'm going to mask it all out so that you only see it, you know, basically right in front of Dr. Premalt. I don't want it to get too low in the frame. You know, the reason I did that, I'm just looking over here and I'm trying to mimic what I see, okay? Cool, so now we've got this nice little base layer going on, but I still feel like we're missing a ton of detail. So now, what are we gonna do? We're gonna duplicate our layer. So I'm gonna duplicate this background layer. And I should be renaming these, by the way, so that whoever inherits this from me doesn't hate me. And so this is gonna be the detail smoke. And so what I'm gonna do for this, I'm gonna start with sort of a fresh setup here. I'm going to delete my extra fractal noise. I'm going to delete the sharpen. I don't need that. And I'm going to delete my masks because because I kind of want like a base level of something going on back here. And I'm going to change this back to that basic noise type. Now, if I turn all these off, right? So if you remember, the basic noise type normally has a lot more noise on it like this. Let me just actually reset this. If I hit reset on this effect, here we go. I'll go back to the transform, turn off uniform scaling, stretch it out like this, okay? Now I've still got that movement happening and the evolution is still happening, but now it's this much grainier thing, and if I make the complexity high, like I crank it up to 15 or something, if I zoom in and go full res, you'll see there's a lot of noise in there now. It's almost like grain, and if I crank up the sub-influence, I get even more. And so having something like this in the background, I think is just gonna kind of start to help me mimic this kind of thing going on, right? So really what I'm after is like this noisy sort of detail-y thing, okay? Let's unsolo this, take a look. All right, so I'm going to turn my tritone back on, and turbulent displace I'm gonna leave off for now. I might actually just delete that. And so this is in overlay mode right now, which might be okay, but it's really causing some issues with like dark pixels and stuff. Even at like a low opacity, like it's still causing issues. So I can't use overlay mode. And so this is where literally like I'm just gonna experiment. So I'm hitting shift and plus to kind of cycle through these things. And, you know, Mark has said this before, but sometimes it's all about the happy accidents, right? So that multiply mode is giving me the closest thing to what I'm looking for. And I think what I probably need to do is make the shadows not so dark. So let me just click on this and just boost this up. And I think that's gonna help us a lot. And then I can just kind of dial in the opacity. Cool. All right, and so now we've got this base layer, and I'm gonna have to start previewing at half res because I don't want you to have to sit and watch this whole thing. But you can see we're starting to get something pretty nifty going on. And what's really cool is because it's all built with just simple effects. Let's say if I don't want it in front of the head as much, I can do that, sort of spotlight, you know, that face. All right, let's do a few more things. I noticed earlier that the silhouette had this nice little kind of light wrappy thing going on. So how do we do that? So the recipe for a light wrap, hopefully by now you realize isn't really that complicated. There are one-click effects that do it, but generally I roll my own, and the way I do it is like so. I make a solid, I'm gonna call it light wrap, and I'm gonna make it a color that is like a bright color in this comp. So there we go. Then I'm going to add the set matte effect, and for the matte, I want it to use my keyed out scientist here, okay? Now you'll see it's the wrong size because I've scaled my scientist down, but this is actually taking the original size. So there's an easy fix for that. If I bring up my parenting column, which is hidden for some reason, if I parent this to the scientist while holding Option, it will immediately match the transform. And so then what I need to do is invert this matte, okay? So now I have a cutout of the scientist. And then I need to add a blur. So I'm gonna use a fast box blur, right? And so I'm blurring it. So now you're starting to see that light wrap. And then I can just duplicate the set matte effect and turn off invert. And there we go. There is our light wrap. And if I want less light wrap, I can dial it in with this blur. I might change this to add mode, which will make it glow a little bit more, which is kind of cool. And I can also change the color because it's feeling like a little oversaturated. So what I might just do, just to make this easy, is hue and saturation, bring saturation down. Trying to get it a little more tealy. And then I don't want it on the feet, so I'm gonna just kind of mask it off here. Feather that, boom, okay? And then I can dial that in with opacity and try to match my reference. Cool? So we are getting close, people. Now, here's another thing that I still feel like we don't have, which are these really hard edge-defined wisps. There's no wisp effect in After Effects, unfortunately. And so how might we accomplish this? Well, I'm going to show you another trick. So let's call this the wisps solid. And we are going to use another effect that is not very common. It's in the generate menu and it's called cell pattern. Okay. Now cell pattern just creates these interesting little cell patterns. There's different ones. And so this is another great place to go and look for anything sort of organic like this. You can sometimes find a good starting point with these weird effects like this, okay? And so looking at I think the crystals one, either crystals, let's look at bubbles first. Now, at first glance, this may seem completely useless to you, okay? But to me, I see potential. I'm gonna click invert. And now we've got these nice white outlines, but they're super small, right? So obviously the size is gonna have to be bigger. There's some interesting settings here. This disperse, if you turn it to 0, just creates this grid. If I crank it up, now it's completely random. There's also evolution here, but I don't know if we really need that. We probably do need a little bit of it. But the size is the main thing. Now, unfortunately, this still does not look like sort of, wispy kind of long strands the way I would like. I also can't separate the X and Y dimensions here. So what to do? Well, it's actually comically simple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make the size of this solid much smaller, like 100 pixels, and then I'm going to just stretch it. And look at that. Look, see what it did? And so now I can kind of play with the size until I get like sort of the amount of wisps that I would like. So let's go ahead and add our expressions that we know we're going to need. So we're going to say, X equals time times, maybe 200, and then Y is 0, and then XY. And so now this is moving, and then we can also have it evolving, because that will probably make it feel a little bit more natural, right? So let's try that. I mean, that ain't bad, right? I think it could maybe evolve a little faster, just so it feels like, yeah, there we go. It's pretty cool. And I feel like the scale of it is probably too big, so I'm gonna turn the size down. And on the scale, I may want to make this a little bit bigger. So maybe if I make it 200 pixels, and then I can scale this down. And what this is doing is it's just helping me maintain a little more detail as I stretch it out like that. Cool. If I just say screened this over the whole thing, right? It's already, you can kind of see the potential of it, but the main problem I'm having is I want more contrast here. I don't want all this fuzzy gray stuff. I really just want like some hard edges. And so if I turn the contrast up, it's not really doing what I want. So I'm going to have to color correct this to get exactly what I want, right? So what I really want is the grays to just kind of be darker, but keep the whites pretty hot, right? And so with curves, you have a lot more control than, say, levels, right? I can keep the blacks where they are. I can push the whites a little harder, but then I can bring the grays down a little bit, right? And I probably need to bring these down a little bit more too. Yeah, there we go, okay? And you start to get more hard edges that way. And then if I really wanted, I could even do something crazy, like add a sharpen effect, right? Don't tell anybody, please. And if I crank this thing up, it's going to start to add even some weird kind of like noisiness to it, right? This is obviously going to be kind of too intense, and it's not the right color either. So what I probably want to do is grab my tritone effect, throw that on my wisps, and then just bring that opacity way down like that. And now it's moving way too fast, but I think it is going to work. So I'm going to change that offset to like, 40. I want it to be much slower. Yeah, and then the offset can be, or the evolution can be slower as well. Lovely. And I don't want it to show up down here or up there as much, so I'm going to mask it out so it only shows up kind of where I want it, and I'll feather it. All right, there we go. Lovely. All right, let's talk about a few more things with this, all right? And then we're going to move on, and I'll do a couple of more quick examples. So there's also, just kind of staring at this, especially if you zoom in, there's a lot of like nice grain and noise over this whole thing. So that's pretty obvious what you want to do, right? You want to add some noise. So I'm going to add a noise adjustment, and let me make sure that it is the size of the comp. And on that layer, I will add the add grain effect, and turn this into an adjustment layer and set this to final output. And right there, it kind of did it, and just kind of like having noise sort of breaks this image up even more and makes it work even better. Then I think the last thing that I want to do is just try to get the colors to be a little bit closer to my reference. I feel like I'm not getting the intensity I want back here. So remember, I've got this like shape layer 2 is like the bright shape, right? What if I just duplicate it? Scale it down, right? And maybe this one could be in add mode, right? And what I may actually want to do is bring that above the smoke and all that kind of stuff. Let me see if I switch that back to screen, because it was getting a little crazy in add mode. Yeah, there we go. So I just duplicated one layer, I moved it up, and now I've got way more intensity. And now I could even like do something cool, like kind of shape the intensity so it's like right up around the head or something like that. Yeah, and this is feeling pretty good. I mean, like you could do a lot more work to really break up this bottom edge here. I could add another layer of noise down here that's kind of sculpted to break up this dark area, kind of the way this light area is being broken up. And frankly, I think if I layered even a few more pieces of fractal noise on top of this, you'd get an even better result. But hopefully, what you've seen so far, is getting you excited about starting to become your own mad scientist and come up with your own concoctions. So I made you sit through that because again, beating the dead horse, which is a thing I like to do apparently, I wanted you to see what it looks like when you're taking an effect from a piece of reference, breaking it into little visual components, and recreating it. This is not a fractal noise bonus lesson. This is not a how to generate smoke bonus lesson. If you can learn to channel that inner Kramer, it's going to make you a much more dangerous compositor, all right? So now let's look at a different example. All right, so here's the next reference, and you're probably already thinking, fractal noise. Yes, we're going to use fractal noise. But I thought this would be interesting because this is something where if you really want to try to recreate the look of this, and this is sort of like an anime speed lines, like you'd see behind the character in a video game or something. If you want to be able to control your image to really match the style of this one, right? And what I'm talking about is obviously there's like some speedy lines going through, but notice the yellow lines are kind of only in the middle here, and there's way more purple showing through on the edges here. You're gonna have to think about how to actually pull that off in a controllable way, okay? So let's just start by doing some fractal noise, seeing if we can even approximate this look, all right? Which of course we can. So I'm gonna make a new solid. I'm going to apply fractal noise to it. And I know I'm going to have to stretch it out scale-wise on X to get these sort of like thin lines like that. And I mean, geez, we're like almost there already. And I'm just going to kind of like scrub this through on offset turbulence to kind of get a sense of, yeah, I think that's going to work, right? Once you've used fractal noise a few times, you just start to see it everywhere. It really is like everything is fractal noise all the way down. So now I can play with the contrast, right? And I can play with the brightness. And what's cool is, using this brightness is going to let you sort of reveal or hide more of this fractal noise, okay? See where I'm going? See where I'm going with this? All right, so let's start with a base layer. The base layer, I think, is just this dark purple color. That doesn't even need to be fractal noise. So what's the next layer of noise that we're going to need? Because I'm thinking that the easiest way to do this is going to be each color kind of gets its own layer, right? And so I think the next layer is kind of this reddish one. It kind of gets dark in here, right? Like there's this dark red, but all these streaks are kind of hot pink. So let's try that. Let's go ahead and turn this back on and add a tint effect, right? And then pick that red color. And then I could screen that on top, right? And stick that back there. And I'm gonna want to animate it, but I'm already seeing a problem. The problem is if I have to screen this on top, then my colors are going to get messed up. So what I actually need to do is knock out the black. Now, how do you do that? I'm glad you asked. This is where, learning about channels, the way Mark's taught you in this class, and even the bonus lesson back in the first focus week about using a node-based compositor, that experience is actually where the idea I'm having came from. What I'm thinking is, this is the alpha channel I want, okay? Well, currently it's not the alpha channel. If I hit option 4, the alpha channel for that is all white. This is just an RGB image. But I am aware that I can shift those channels around and make this the alpha channel. Now, how do I do that? With the shift channels effect. So I'm going to tell it to take its alpha from the luminance, and then I'm going to turn everything else full on, meaning white. And now when I tint it, it looks the same, but watch this. I turn on the transparency grid, and all of a sudden, I can see through it, which means it can be in normal mode, which means I can match this really well, okay? And because this is on its own layer, right? For example, I'm noticing that at the edges here, you're kind of not getting as much noise, right? You're getting some, but not as much. So how could I possibly do that, right? Because I don't want to mess with the fractal noise settings. I like what I'm getting. I just want sort of fewer strands up here. Well, it's going to be kind of tricky. Well, I'm trying to think. I'm thinking, and I want you to think too. All right, here's what we're going to try. I want to see if I take a levels effect and I set it into alpha mode. Stick this here. If I crush these blacks, see how these lines kind of go away, right? Especially if I play with this gamma here, right? I can drastically affect sort of how many, and I can even kind of kill the whites a little bit so that they're kind of like even fainter. So if I turn that on and off, you can see that this is a way that I can sort of control how many of these things I'm seeing. I don't want the whole thing to look like this, right? I only want the edges. So fortunately, After Effects has a feature where I can draw a mask like this. And then I could invert that mask. And then down here on that levels effect, I can click the compositing plus button. And now that levels effect only shows up where that mask is. And I can feather that mask. And now we're getting something closer to what we're after, okay? It's still not perfect, but it's kind of helping. So I think what we're really gonna need to do is actually create another layer that's gonna cover up some of this with purple. So this is sort of a pink noise right here. I'm gonna duplicate it, and I'm gonna call this purple noise. And the idea, let me turn this pink layer off for a minute. Let me delete this mask for 1 second. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna change this color to the actual background color of purple. I'm gonna put it above the pink noise. And then what I'm gonna do is just get rid of this levels effect, okay? And what you'll see, right now, this purple noise is an exact copy of the pink noise. So when I turn it on, it just kind of darkens everything, right? But what if it wasn't a copy? What if I went into this fractal noise evolution options and I picked a different random seed, okay? So now what's happening is this purple noise is breaking up the pink noise. And I can control where it breaks it up. So if I don't want it to break it up anywhere except the edges, I could draw a mask and invert it and feather it. And now you can see that along the edges, it is breaking it up more, okay? So we're getting much, much closer. And I could even sort of play with the scale if I wanted to. I could play with the settings on this fractal noise effect and maybe, I don't know, scale the height up a little bit so I even get bigger sort of chunks of purple breaking things up. Right? And nothing's animated yet, so you can't really see, but you can see how I'm sort of controlling this just by thinking like a compositor. So I've got this purple noise on top, I've got the pink noise, and I'm also noticing that in the middle here, the background isn't purple, it's kind of this other dark red. So why don't I duplicate this solid, and just to make it easy, add the tint effect, and I can just map both of those to the same color. But then I can just draw a mask, feather it, and now I want these yellow streaks, right? So let me duplicate the pink noise, and let's pick that yellow color. And you can see there's way too much of it, right? We've got to dial that back. So let me delete that mask, and let me rename this yellow noise. And I'm going to turn off this levels effect for a minute. We're going to really have to think hard. How do we get only a few of these little strands, okay? So if we kind of start back at the beginning here, just in our fractal noise effect, remember we really cranked the contrast of this thing, right? And the brightness. So if I lower the brightness down like this, but leave the contrast pretty high, you start to get fewer and fewer little streaks, okay? And then I can also come into transform and I could scale the width so that they get longer and longer. And so now there's only these few, and I can maybe crank the brightness a little bit, although I don't want to. I actually want to leave them. I just want like just a very few, and then I'll probably use like a levels effect to brighten them a little bit, right? But something like that, and you can sort of imagine like as this evolves, there'd be just way fewer of them. Then I shift the channels in the levels. Let me reset this for a minute. If I try to boost that alpha, I'm gonna kind of brighten those, and they'll be a little bit. You'll be able to see them a little bit easier, which is going to be nice. And then there's my tint effect, and there we go. Now, of course, I can just grab a mask and mask it out so it's only right in the middle, like so. And I can feather that mask a little bit. But by feathering it, I'm getting a weird effect, which is kind of interesting. I wonder why that's happening. It's kind of neat. Well, we don't need to feather it, actually, but there you go, right? We've basically rebuilt this, and it's totally controllable. And you can see there's a little bit of yellow up there. The yellow is kind of showing through a little bit, and there's a little bit more red there. So that purple noise, what I could do is kind of like tone it down a little bit, like just play with the opacity. And then in the yellow channel, I could just add another little section up here, right? So that I could have a few yellow streaks. And if I wanted those yellow streaks to be fainter at the top, I could try adjusting the mask opacity, but this is where the order of operations is kind of starting to hose us. So with some of these layers, the thing to do might actually be to create a plain old matte layer and just do an alpha matte, and that way you won't run into any of these effects. So I want a little bit of yellow up there. I want a lot of yellow, like in the middle, maybe a little bit down here. But then on mask 3 and mask 1, the opacity doesn't have to be 100%. Maybe it's 50%. And so hopefully what you're learning from this little demo is just how granular you can get when you start thinking like a compositor. And even something simple like fractal noise and the tint effect, shifting some channels around, It can get you an insane amount of control where you can literally recreate something, but now you can animate it. You could offset, on X and all that fun stuff and make a really cool effect that you probably never made before. All right, this has already been a marathon bonus lesson, but I think you got room for one more example. If you don't, I understand. You can totally bail. Just turn the computer off, go outside, go play with your kids if you have them. But if you don't, then stay with me. I'm going to show you one more example, and I thought this would be a good one because this is something that could actually come in useful on the Dr. P exercise. And also, it's just a great example of something that looks really, really complicated at first, but if you can learn to break it down into little visual pieces, you can actually rebuild it piece by piece using built-in tools really easily, and I'm going to show you how to do it. All right, for the final reference, I found this really cool image with this crazy glitchy effect. And looking at this, you might not even know where to start. I mean, there's so much going on here, and it can be kind of daunting. If a client gave this to you as a reference, you'd probably say, all right, what plugin is this, right? And in truth, you probably could get pretty close with a few plugins, but here's the secret. You don't need them. You can do this yourself. So how the heck do you approach something like this? All right, so let's start with the basics. So we've got Dr. P. Let's just zoom in. And what I want you to do is just notice what makes this image look the way it does. So there's obviously these glitches, okay? This sort of digital glitchy thing happening, but don't think of it like that, okay? It's not a glitch. What is it? It's pieces of the image being displaced, right? And not just pieces of the image, but different channels of the image being displaced kind of in different ways, right? This looks a lot like an effect that you've probably heard of called chromatic aberration. But it's kind of a little bit more than that, because if you look at, the sword is kind of like in one piece here, but then up here it breaks into this purple and this green channel, which, by the way, aren't real. Like, it's RGB. It's not purple and green and blue. So there's a lot going on here. And then there's like this noise, and there's kind of this like scanline effect. So we're going to start simple, and we're going to build up, okay? Let's start with this chromatic aberration effect. Now, I bet before you took this class, there's a good chance you'd never actually used the channels tool or any of the channels effects in After Effects. Most motion designers don't have to use them. Compositors use them all the time. So what I'm going to do is apply an effect called Shift Channels, which you've already seen, and I am going to leave alpha and red the same, but I'm going to say turn green and blue off, full off. Now I get the red channel of Dr. P. So why don't I call this red? If I duplicate this and rename it green, I bet you can guess what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn the red off, but turn the green back on. And then I'm going to duplicate this and call this blue. And I'm going to turn green off and turn the blue back on. So now we've got red, blue, and green versions of Dr. P. And if I turn the top two layers to screen, look at that. We have rebuilt Dr. P, except there are now 3 channels. And the beauty of this is that I can shift them and create this interesting effect. I'll tell you what's really interesting is that having this dark blue background has actually shifted the color of these channels so that it almost matches the reference. If I turn this off and it's black, it still looks a little bit magenta and green, but I bet if I move the blue, let's see here. Aha, that's what's going on. If I move that blue channel off of the red, that's when it starts to look wrong, right? So I'm going to have to be very careful about where that blue channel goes. So I'm not going to move that too much. Okay. So look at that. I mean, just there, we're already starting to get that chromatic aberration effect, okay? So that was a pretty simple thing. However, you may notice now, his face is all messed up. It's kind of sad. And somehow, in spite of having chromatic aberration, this image has a ton of sharpness to it. So how could we get some sharpness back on Dr. P? Well, first thing we could do is pre-comp and add some sharpness. So I'll just add a sharpen effect. Just crank that up. Whoa, look at that. That's too much. But if I crank it to maybe like 50, it's helping. We are getting some sharpness back, but I don't think that's going to be enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a copy of this, and I'm going to call this sharper. Let me turn the shift channels off. This is just a copy of the original footage. It's in normal mode. All right, so it's about as sharp as you're going to get. Let me go to full res here. And maybe what I'll do is just kind of like, I just want to basically just get the details back in there. So what I'm thinking I might be able to do is kind of manipulate this top layer a little bit so that I'm not distracted by the color, because I like how the color shifted in this one. But then I kind of need the details. And details in an image typically come from the luminance more than the color. So what if I actually just remove the color? What if I just desaturate this, okay? And then set this to luminosity. That's really interesting, isn't it? Because what that did was it adjusted the value, the brightness of each pixel underneath, right? But it didn't really mess with the colors. So now I've got a sharp Dr. P again, but I've got the chromatic aberration. And I know you may not believe this, but I did not know that that would work until just now, which I guess kind of proves the whole point of this bonus lesson, that once you can start to sort of reverse engineer things you're looking at, and literally I will do this in real life. Like if I see a pond ripple, I'm thinking, that's a displacement map with radio waves that's been blurred. Like I can literally pick apart real world effects and start to piece them back together. This is the goal. This is what you're after as a compositor. All right, so if we go back up one level, I definitely don't need this to be as sharp, but I did like a little bit of sharpness on there, right? And if I put this in full res, you can see that's actually, that's pretty nifty. So that was kind of one thing that we've kind of figured out how to do. Now, what about all these glitches? Yeah, that's probably the big thing you're wondering about. So how to do glitches. There's a lot of different ways to do them. There are great plugins to make it really easy. If you want to art direct your glitches, you're going to have to do it yourself. It is totally okay, by the way, to just Google how to make a glitch in After Effects or any other effect if you don't know where to start. Knowing what you know now, especially once you're done with this class, all you're going to need in most cases is a little breadcrumb to get you started, and then you're going to be able to figure it out the rest of the way. Do not feel bad. Do not feel like you have to know everything. It's all out there on the internet and YouTube. Half of it's probably on School of Motion at this point, but don't be afraid of looking to the internet for a start. So if you do Google how to do a glitch in After Effects, most likely Andrew Kramer will pop up. And what he will tell you, like most people, is that you're going to use the displacement map effect, okay? Here's how it works. If I just apply it to Dr. P, so I'm going to put the displacement map effect on him. And what this effect does is it moves the pixels of an image around, left or right, up or down, and it does this based on something, right? On either the image itself or on another layer. And in this case, I want it to be another layer. Now, looking at the shape of these glitches, you can see they're very geometric. It's like little blocks have been ripped off of this image. So I need to somehow generate a bunch of random blocks. Now, what effect might do that? Oh, wow, I didn't even realize I typed in fractal noise. So fractal noise has a noise type called block. Look at that. Isn't that cool? Once it's in block, it doesn't really matter what the actual fractal type is. I mean, you can kind of play around. You might get some interesting effects. And actually, that max looked really neat. I've never done that before. Let's leave it there. Now, let me just demonstrate what this is going to do now. If I bring this to the bottom of my comp, I can turn it off even. And on that Dr. P layer, I'm now going to set the displacement map layer to fractal noise. And I do need to change this to effects and masks. So now it's using the fractal noise effect. Now, I'm going to turn vertical displacement to 0, and I want it to use the luminance of that layer. Now watch this. If I crank this, you see how it spreads out the image. And if I turn on the fractal noise, you'll see, like so, that it's doing it sort of along these blocks, okay? So that's really cool. That's very helpful. This isn't working exactly the way it needs to, of course. Right now, it's kind of spreading Dr. P apart, left and right. I just want to kind of blow all the pieces off to the right like this thing. So how could I control that? Well, if you think about it, how is that displacement map effect working? It's looking at the brightness values of the pixels, and it's saying, okay, well, if it's white, I want to push it one way. If it's black, I want to push it the other way. If it's gray, I don't want to push it at all. So what I want to do is make sure that none of these pixels are past that gray point. Easiest way to do that would be with levels. So with a levels effect, first thing I can do is I can get a little more contrast out of this, which would be kind of nice, right? But then I can set the black point, right, the output of the black, to right in the middle. Now, we are in 8-bit mode, so black and white only go to 255. So I want black to be half of 255. I can't do that in my head, so I'm just going to type in 255 divided by 2. After Effects does it for me. Beautiful. And now Dr. P will only move one way. Okay, so if I click on him, right, things will only move in one direction, which is very, very handy. Very cool. All right, now we've got another problem. I don't actually want the entire image to be broken up. And looking at our reference, it kind of looks like some of the channels are shifted differently in different spots, right? So I kind of need some more fine control. So what I'm going to do is take this displacement map into here. And I am going to actually just apply it to each channel individually. And I'm also going to need my fractal noise layer. So let me copy that in there too. And let's start with the red channel. Okay, so now if I play with this, you'll see just the red channels being shifted. Okay, so let's say I want that red channel shifted, I don't know, like that. Cool. Well, I don't want it shifted like entirely, you know, I want just a piece of it shifted. I want some control over that. So there's a great feature in After Effects where I can draw a mask on a layer, right, like this. And I can draw a few layers, I can draw a few masks. And then I can come into my effects on this layer, go to displacement map, and every effect has this tiny little option, compositing options. And if you click the plus, it will then constrain that effect to the mask. But you can have more than one mask in there. So now, this effect is only happening within the mask bounds. Pretty slick. So now, what I want to do is copy these masks onto these other layers. And then I want to copy that displacement map effect onto these other layers. And starting with green, what I might do is first give it a different horizontal displacement, but then also take these masks and kind of move them, right? Because now I can control where these little glitches are showing up like this. And that's pretty cool. I'm kind of digging this. There we go. All right, and maybe this one can just be kind of like off to the side. And then we'll do the same thing with blue. Excellent, okay? So now we're getting somewhere, but you can see that like there's not a ton of variation with these glitches. And there's also, it appears to be just some overall glitches too. So this is where the whole concept of layering effects is really gonna help you out. So if I make, let's say, an adjustment layer here, right? I am going to put it right at the top. I'm also going to duplicate this fractal noise layer, and I'm gonna call this fine noise. And in this layer, what I want to do is turn the sub settings up a little bit more to get some of these finer little details here. And then I'm going to turn the overall complexity up, which I don't know if it's going to do much in block mode, probably nothing. But I'm going to scale things down. Okay, so I get a lot more of these little dots like this. The reason I'm doing this is because now on this adjustment layer, I can add my displacement map effect. I can set it to the fine noise layer. And then I can turn it to luminance and start pushing some of these things out, right? Now, of course, I don't want it to push the whole image out. I just want little pieces of it, right? Just little things like this. And in this case, because it's an adjustment layer, I can actually just kind of constrain it to little pieces like this just by drawing masks. So you can get these little glitchy kind of pieces like this. And I think that there's kind of too much happening there. So this fine noise, what I'm probably going to do is try to get a little more contrast in it so that it feels like there's sort of fewer pieces. So what I might do is just play with the levels a little bit. And if I leave this over here at white and I crush these blacks like this, what I'm now doing is essentially getting rid of a lot of these. And what's cool is I can actually sort of play with this in real time and see what that's going to do to my glitchies, right? And then I can, you know, I could sort of like play with this some more. I could really kind of like dial this up. Let me stretch this one out a little bit because there's some interesting stuff. And then, you know, why the heck not? Why not just like duplicate this again, but then move these masks around, right? But then on this version, have them not go as far. Just a little bit over, right? And I don't want it on his face probably. Right, so I'm just duplicating and making variation, and of course all of these things could be animated. You can get as detailed as you want, right? And then if we go back to our main comp, look at what we've got, okay? So we're starting to get something very, very interesting here. Now the colors are starting to get kind of funky, so we do need to do something about that. So the first thing I would probably try is just the plain old hue and saturation effect, because I bet if I desaturate these and play with the hue, I can start to get them a little closer anyway, right? Yeah, so by kind of pushing the hue over this way, you can see that, you know, at least the green and the red is turning a little bit magenta. I may want to desaturate things a little bit more. And then what I'm going to do is, you know, all of these colors that I don't like this orange here, like if I go to reds and I hue shift, I can just kind of deal with the reds. If I go to yellows, I can just deal with yellows. And what I want to do with yellows is basically push them to green like this. And then with greens, I kind of want to, I actually really want to push them more kind of teal, right? Like kind of in there. So I'll go back to yellows and kind of fix that to match a little bit. Obviously, like you can spend a lot of time really dialing this in. There also seems to be a little bit of like a faint kind of fuzzy glow, which I just noticed kind of looking at this, right? It's almost like the blue channel's been like blurred or something like that. I don't know. How might we do that? Well, I've got this pre-comp here with all these beautiful effects on it. So let me duplicate this for a minute. And I'm going to call this glow. And I'm going to see if I can somehow extract the blue channel from this. You think that's possible? I bet it is. So I'm going to leave these effects on for now, and I'm going to apply a shift channels. And I'm just going to turn off everything except for blue. And then what I want to do is blur this. So I'm just going to do a fast box blur. And I'm going to blur it like so. And I think I'm going to put it behind Dr. P, like that. Aha, look at that. First try. And that's kind of what's going on here. And I don't know if I need it over the whole image, but that is kind of doing a little something for me. And I also think just having an overall subtle glow on this is really going to help too. So let me call this the blue glow, and then come up here and duplicate this, and I'll call this the Dr. P glow. And then I'll just put another fast box blur on here and blur him, and put this into add mode, and then turn that to like just 1% or 2%, like just something super subtle, right? It's one of those things like you almost don't even notice it. It's 5%, but it just adds a little bit of that brightness to it. So we still got some more work to do, but like look how far we've gotten already, okay? One of the things that you've, I'm sure, been fixating on is these lines. And there's a ton of noise on this too. So I think that we should start with these lines, okay? These scan lines, sort of mimicking like an old CRT TV. So again, going back to this idea of these are not scan lines. They are a series of horizontal lines that are a little fuzzy and noisy. So knowing that, how might you make those? Well, there's a shape tool. You could make a line. You could put it in a repeater, duplicate it a bunch of times. You could blur it a little bit and put some noise on it. There's actually an easier way, but I just wanted to kind of point out that you don't have to think so literally. Just think in terms of what does this look like. So what I'm going to do is just make a solid like this. And again, going back to my deep knowledge of the effects and After Effects from years of experience, Venetian blinds pops into my head because literally it just makes lines like this. It's one of these effects you'd think, I will never use this. Why the hell would I? Well, this is why. Scan lines. And so I'm going to adjust the width and the transition completeness kind of to taste. If I'm trying to match this, I might like zoom in, but really I'm more concerned that I just get the overall vibe of it. One thing I don't like is having the lines go over his face, and they're obviously, they need to be adjusted, but looking at this, the lines really don't show up that well over the bright areas of this. They show up more over the dark areas. So that's a transfer mode thing. I could set it to say darken, right? And so then, they're just going to show up over the background, right, which is lighter. I'm still kind of not getting really the effect I want. So I think what I might do is put a fill effect on this so I can kind of play around, right? Because what I was doing was using the lines to brighten things, but I could also use them to darken things, right? And that way, if I set this to lighten mode or screen mode, let's see, I'm going to play around. Yeah, lighten mode, it shows up on the background, but not so much on him. What about overlay mode? A little heavy, but if I dial it back a little bit, yeah, I think we're probably gonna stick with screen mode or lighten mode is probably gonna be what we want. Yeah, there we go. And then I want them to be a little bit fatter. They are definitely too sharp right now, for sure. To fix that, that's an easy one. We're just gonna put a blur on that, and we can just blur it vertically by, you want to barely touch it, like, even like 0.1 pixels is going to do it. And then we want to add some noise to them, just plain old noise, because they're really kind of crunchy looking at this. So noise HLS just adds noise, but it lets you be very specific. Are you creating hue noise, like the colors are changing, lightness noise? In this case, I just want lightness noise. And looking at it, you can see exactly what it does. And actually, I now think that this might be a really cool thing to do. If I go in here, on these individual channels, right? Like the red channel. One of the things I'm noticing is that these are so clean. So what if I copy that noise HLS effect in there? Because with the HLS, I can actually really dial in. Like I want a teeny bit of noise on the hue. I want more on the lightness, right? But maybe even a little more on the hue. Like you can see some of that color coming in now, right? And maybe I can just copy that to these the red, green, and blue, because you know, it's just kind of give it a little bit more of that like texture and that grittiness to it. Yeah, I was just noticing how much detail there is, how much noise. It's a nice look. All right, let's go back here, and you can see like getting a pretty cool little result here. All right, so we've got our scan lines and we've got our glitches. What else are we missing? We've even got this little blue glow back there. Well, there's kind of like some overall glitchiness that, you know, could be applied across the whole thing. I could add another layer of adjustment to it. But, you know, in the end, I mean, I think we're pretty close. There's like this little bit of light kind of coming over the shoulder here that's kind of cool. So I'm thinking, you know, I could kind of do that just by, I could just make like a shape layer, like kind of behind the doctor, behind the good doctor. Let's put that back here. And that color is not correct. So I am going to just grab like sort of a light gray, and I'm going to blur that with a fast blur, just kind of blur the heck out of it. And then I'm going to tone it way down. I just want like a little bit of that to show through, right? Just to kind of help pop him off that background a little bit. I'm kind of looking at this area right here on the reference image and just trying to mimic that a little bit. Here's a good tip. When you're doing like fine adjustments like this, sometimes the user interface stuff can get in the way. So if you click this, right, that will kind of remove any masks from you. But if you hit Shift-Command-H, it hides everything, including those little squares. And so now I can like dial this stuff in really precisely because I don't have that UI getting in the way, okay? And I can like nudge it over to the right a little bit. Cool. And then the last thing, I might just color correct Dr. P a little bit because I feel like there's a lot of black in here, and I'm noticing that, I don't know, I mean, he's wearing a white lab coat, so there may not be much I can do, but let's give it the old try. So I'm going to use the curves effect, and I'm just going to try to pull down to get as much contrast in the darker areas as I can, but then I'm going to have to obviously like boost most of the image back up. And I don't want to butcher it too much. And now his lab coat is getting so white that now what I think I might actually need to do is bring those whites down a little bit so that they're not 100% white. Because I think that that's actually what's going on with this image too. And frankly, this would be an interesting thing to do real quick. I'm going to open up my info panel here. And I'm doing this because if I hover over Dr. P's coat, right, you can see it's basically white. If I hover over this image, let's see, is this actually white? Because to me it looks a little yellow. Yeah, I'm looking at the RGB values. You can see there's much more green in the whites. Interesting. So that's a subtle thing that I think is going to show up here. So what I could do is come into the green channel, and if I pull it up, you'll see it adds green into the image, but I only want it to add green into the whites. And so what I'm going to do is kind of pull this, try to shape this curve a little bit. And I think in this case, I'm going to bail on curves because it's going to be really finicky. What I'm going to do is just add levels, which is a lot easier to control. So if I go into the green channel and I just kind of knock the white down, that does the opposite. So I'm going to knock the black down. You can see it's adding just a little bit of green, just a hint of it, right? And then I can go into my RGB and I can add some of that contrast back in overall, but still leaving some of that green in those pixels, okay? Cool. All right, so it's not an exact match, and you know now there's this other thing too that I'm noticing, which is all of these little red and green and blue little specks, which to me feels like a fractal noise thing. And so, I mean, what the heck, right? You still with me? Gone this far, want to go all the way. So what if we try to make that with fractal noise, these little specks that are in the background? So fractal noise, and it may not be obvious at all how you're going to get that from fractal noise, okay? But have faith. Look at all of these different things that you have. Try to find something where you're kind of like, yeah, I can kind of imagine that's almost creating that shape, but I need to really crush the contrast or something, right? So I'm just kind of going through all of these. Wait, let me go back one. Maybe. Sometimes when you're not sure, crank the contrast up. Lo and behold, look at that. Crank the contrast up. Bring the brightness back a little bit. This one's promising. This one is promising. All right, I'm going to reset this. So that was smeary. Let's look at some of these other ones. Let's look at terrain. No. We could also look at the basic one. The basic one might, if we crank it enough, we might be able to get little shapes like that. And actually, to be honest, I think you're kind of there. That's basically it. And then by adjusting, sort of the ratio of brightness to contrast, you can have more or less of them, and you can make them smaller. I want them pretty small, like this. because I can always duplicate this and add more. And what's great about this is you can animate this, but I don't really need to. What I now want to do is use that same shift channels effect that we did on the anime lines so that I can basically just use normal mode and apply a color to these. Now you know that trick too. Shift channels, we're going to take the alpha from the luminance, everything else is full on. And now we've got those specks, and then if we fill those specks with what appears to be just red, green, and blue, maybe a little desaturated or something, but no big deal. Let me just kind of stick those way in the back here, right? So then you've got your red specks, and then you've got your green specks, and the green ones obviously need to be green, but also they need to be in a different position than the red ones. Otherwise you won't see any difference. So I could pick a different random seed. Pretty straightforward, right? And now we got some green ones, and then we got some blue ones, and I'm kind of like quickly just doing this instead of being precise and eyeballing these colors and stuff. Hopefully you see the point here. This is all completely doable with the built-in tools. And then, I might dial this back a little bit because they are a little crazy. And now kind of looking at the, looking at this one, I mean, these scan lines are just so much more apparent. So I might kind of make those a little bigger, a little brighter or something, give it a little something. And also the scan lines, I kind of don't like how they're just flat across the whole thing. So this is where you start kind of using your critical eye. I might kind of add a little vignette to them or something like that just to try to help that out. But there you go. We have sort of approximated this look using built-in effects. Obviously you can get way more detailed. You can animate all of this. There's a lot of neat things that can be done. But the whole point was just to show you how to look at a reference image, how to break down the little visual details, what makes this image look the way it does, and then use your Swiss Army knife, After Effects, to create those effects. If you made it this far, I owe you a beer. Fist bump. That was a long one and very dense, and there was a lot of fractal noise in there. I think that may hold the world record for the most fractal noise in a video. However, I really hope that what you took away from this is that it's important to learn how to see. Look at visual reference, not literally, but as just pixels, just visual elements. That looks like a displacement map. That looks like fractal noise. That's turbulent displace. You'll start to see the real world in those terms if you do this long enough, and it's a very useful skill to have as a compositor and as an Andrew Kramer wannabe. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and good luck with the rest of the course.